Hello mind mappers and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be going over The Second Mountain by David Brooks. This was a really great book all about the two different stages that we all go through in life and essentially what we should be focusing on in each one of those stages. If you're looking for some more purpose in your life or a better reason to wake up in the morning, this book is going to be perfect for you. With that, let's dive directly into the introduction. I pulled out a quote that I believe gives us a good overview of what we can expect to learn today. Every once in a while, I meet a person who radiates joy. These are people who seem to glow with an inner light. They're kind, tranquil, delighted by small pleasures, and grateful for the larger ones. These people are not perfect. They get exhausted and stressed. They make errors in judgment, but they live for others and not for themselves. They've made unshakable commitments to family, a cause, a community, or a faith. They know that they were put on this earth and derive a deep satisfaction from doing what they have been called to do. Life isn't easy for these people. They've taken on the burdens of others, but they have a serenity about them, a settled resolve. They are all interested in you and make you feel cherished and known and take delight in your good. Life for these people has often followed what we might think of as a two-mountain shape. They got out of school, they started their career, and they began climbing the mountain they thought that they were meant to climb. Their goals on the first mountain are the ones that our culture endorses: to be successful, to make your mark, to experience personal happiness. But when they got to the top of that mountain, something happens. They look around and they find that the view is unsatisfying. They realize that this isn't my mountain after all. There's another, bigger mountain out there that is actually my mountain. And so they embark on a new journey. On the second mountain, life moves from self-centered to other-centered. They want the things that are truly worth wanting, not the things that other people tell them that they want. They embrace a life of interdependence, not independence. They surrender to a life of commitment. So what I took out of this first quote is just to take a step back and think, which mountain am I climbing? Which mountain are we climbing? David tells us here, of course, that there are two different mountains. The first one is that one that society markets to us and tells us is potentially the more important of the two. The one that encompasses kind of a high-paying career and money and personal happiness. And then, of course, we have our second mountain. And this is the one that we're talking about today. The one that's less self-centered and instead moving toward other-centered, other people, other communities at the focus of our lives. We're moving away from vanity and selfishness into kindness and understanding. Climbing the second mountain, as David says here, is going to mean commitment. It's going to be the more difficult of the two. We've got 4 specific areas that we're going to be looking at commitment in. We've got family, we've got vocation, we've got faith and philosophy, and we've got community. And before we get into the book, I wanted to give you an overview of why I think climbing the second mountain is important. And it's likely very important specifically to certain people that are listening to this video. If you're someone who's tired with working your heart out and still leaving unfulfilled, if you've ever thought that there just has to be more to this about your career or your life, climbing the second mountain will be the most rewarding and maybe the most difficult journey of your life. David is going to be our guide today on that mountain, giving us timeless wisdom on what's truly important and what to avoid on our path up the second mountain. So let's get into it, but first, let's talk about mind mapping. You can get the most out of these mind maps by following along. They're all free, and you can find the process of how I mind map, plus all 100 plus mind map templates, including this one, at the link down below. Following along with the mind maps is going to help you learn more, remember better, and actually apply these books to your life. And if you're looking to take a little bit of a shortcut, you don't want to do hundreds of hours of reading on particular topics like learning, habits, goal setting, or purpose, you can find my masterclasses where I've essentially synthesized dozens and dozens of books and hundreds of hours of learning into a simple 2-hour-long course or masterclass that you can follow along with and get the best ideas. Let's get directly into our first idea here, which is joy. Happiness is the proper goal for people on the first mountain. So we talked about the two different mountains, and David is saying here that happiness is actually the proper goal for people on the first mountain. And happiness, of course, is great. We all know that. But we only get one life, so we might as well use it hunting for big game to enjoy happiness, but to surpass happiness and actually move towards what he calls joy. Happiness tends to be individual. We measure it by asking, are you happy? And joy tends to be self-transcending. And happiness is something that you pursue. Joy is something that rises up unexpectedly and sweeps over you. Happiness comes from accomplishments, and joy comes from offering gifts. Happiness fades, and we get used to the things that used to make us happy. Joy doesn't fade. To live with joy is to live with wonder, gratitude, and hope. People who are on the second mountain have been transformed. They're deeply committed to the outpouring of love, and it has become a steady force in their lives. So really what I wanted to talk about here about joy is just what are we looking for, right? What are the goals of our life? What is this one kind of experience that we have on this earth? What are we really looking for during that experience? And really, as David points out here, we've got two different ideas. We've got happiness, which is something that we've spoken quite a lot about on the channel. Books that we've read have been books like The How of Happiness, The Myths of Happiness, and The Happiness Hypothesis. And what have we learned inside those books? And if you haven't read them, I recommend that you go and check them out on the channel. But what we've learned essentially is that truly happiness isn't really all it's cracked up to be. Pleasure in the moment derived from material success is not something that lasts, and that's often what we mean when we say happiness. For me, joy, I've come to realize, is something much different. Books that I've read like How to Be Free or A Guide to the Good Life, good Stoic philosophy books, as well as Flourish by Martin Seligman, all talk about this concept of joy, and they all have different words for it, of course, but they give us some deep insight into the meaning of joy and how it's just that little bit different than happiness. And the English language, in particular, is one that I find is always difficult. We've got words that mean certain things, and sometimes joy and happiness can seem like the same thing on paper. But specifically, joy comes from purpose, excellence, and duty. It requires maybe a little bit of sacrifice that we'll talk about later. It requires commitment, and it requires working towards something bigger than yourself. But of course, as David says here, and as the Stoics and Martin Seligman have told us many times before, joy is what we should be chasing. How do you get started with joy? Well, as we've spoken about, it starts with commitment. The commitment we make to self-actualize and live up to our truest values, live up to our highest version of ourselves. How do we find those truest and most meaningful virtues? Well, the Stoics are a really great place to get started, and of course, Flourish by Martin Seligman kind of just hashes that out even a little bit further in today's language. But I really think that one simple exercise would be really, really useful. Imagine your final day, and imagine that you've got to write your own eulogy. Think about what and who did you impact or change, and why did you impact and change those people. This is kind of an ideal version of your future. What character traits and values did you consistently demonstrate over your life? At your core, who were you? And who did you care for? Who did you impact and change? Why did you change these people or these persons that you've actually interacted with? What were your major accomplishments in your life? For example, at the ages of 40, 50, and 60, what do you want to be doing? What do you want to be accomplishing or giving to the world? What did you show interest in? What were you passionate and enthusiastic about? Those are all really great places to start. A lot of them are bringing kind of the focus outside of happiness on, what kind of success did you have in your career and what things did you necessarily kind of accomplish, and moving them towards who did you help? Why did you help those people? What did you feel kind of innately called towards? Those are all really great places to start when you're looking to start moving down the path of joy. Our next idea here is commitment. Our commitment allows us to move to a higher level of freedom. In our culture, we think of freedom as the absence of restraint. That's freedom from. But there's another and higher kind of freedom. That is the freedom to. This freedom has fullness of capacity, and it often involves restriction and restraint. So how does freedom involve restriction and restraint? Well, you have to chain yourself to the piano to practice for year after year if you want to have the freedom to really play. You have to chain yourself to a certain set of virtuous habits so that you don't become a slave to your destructive desires. The desire for alcohol and the desire for approval, the desire to lie in bed all day. As theologian Tim Keller puts it, a real freedom is not so much the absence of restriction as finding the right ones. So much of our lives are determined by the definition of freedom that we carry around unconsciously in our heads. On the second mountain, it's actually the chains that set you free. So what I wanted to talk about here was commitment and how it's kind of a bad word in our society. In fact, commitment actually leads to everything that we want. We've got kind of this weird English language around freedom and how there's two definitions. And one of the ones that we have in our head is the one that's actually dictating the way that we interact with freedom all the time. And commitment is kind of the same thing. Commitment is kind of seen as a negative term a lot of the times, but commitment is actually what leads to what we all want, freedom. But not the kind where we lay on the beach all day sipping tequila, which is that freedom from that we're talking about. But instead, commitment leads you to a deeper kind of freedom, and that's the freedom to. The freedom to be able to do something, the freedom to play the piano, the freedom to be free kind of from bad habits or from kind of things that end up bringing you down. The freedom to help people or the freedom to serve. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom to. And in my eyes, it's the freedom to self-actualize, to live your highest life, as in the eulogy exercise that we did previously. This type of freedom might take long hours of practice. It might be hard to accomplish and might not really feel like freedom at all. A quick side note, a lot of you really like Jocko Willink's whole message, which is like discipline equals freedom. I've done some of the book reviews on his books on the channel as well. That's essentially what we're saying here, right? The commitments you make end up setting you free. And now we're going to talk about how commitment really builds your character. Gradually, the big loves overshadow the small ones. Why would you spend your weekends playing golf when you could spend your weekends playing ball with your children? In my experience, people repress bad desires only when they are able to turn their attention to a better desire. When you're deep in a commitment, the distinction between altruism and selfishness begins to fade away. When you serve your child, it feels like you're also serving a piece of yourself. That disposition to good, what having good character is all about. I think this piece, for me, really mirrored a lot of the books on habits that we've talked about. A lot of the books that went into the Habits Masterclass that I recently did, that'll be available in the description. They talk about how instead of kind of focusing on how can I pull out a bad habit, instead try and put something in place of that bad habit that turns out being a good habit. So instead of, for example, sleeping late, wake up and go in and exercise. So replace kind of that one habit that you're doing and put a new habit in its place. Very important to switch the habit out. And I think what David has done really well here is he says, not even just switch it out. Let's switch it out and really connect deeply to the why of the habit, deeply to the why of the action that you're taking. And that's actually a big piece in the Habits Masterclass too. Something that people often miss is that connecting to your why for your habit is often the most powerful motivator that you can get to actually complete the habit. And you need to be very careful with the word why, because it's another one of these words with a double meaning. We get more into that inside the Habits Masterclass. I recommend that you go and check that out. In this way, moral formation is not individual, it's relational. Character is not something that you build by sitting in a room thinking about the difference between right and wrong and about your own willpower. Character emerges from our commitments. If you want to inculcate a character in someone, teach them how to form commitments, temporary ones in childhood, provisional ones in youth, and permanent ones in adulthood. Commitments are the school for moral formation. When your life is defined by fervent commitments, you are at the second mountain. And I think commitment, again, kind of what he's talking about there, is something that the Stoics talk about so much. We don't want to just be librarians of the mind, kind of gathering all of this information and letting it sit. We want to be warriors of the mind. Yes, we want to gather good information from reputable sources, but we also want to be very careful to put that in place in our life and do kind of our own self-experiments. Our next big idea here is called vocation. And we've got kind of 4 different areas. And remember, we spoke about this in the introduction, 4 different areas that we're going to talk about commitments in. So we've talked about joy and how commitment is kind of the gateway to joy. And we're going to talk about commitment and joy in vocation, relationships, faith, and community. Vocation is going to be our first one. Then came World War II and the Nazi occupation. Viktor Frankl found himself thrown into a concentration camp. He realized that the career questions, the what do I want from life, what can I do to make myself happy, are not the proper questions. The real question is, what is life asking of me? And this is coming from Man's Search for Meaning. There's a book review of that book on this channel as well that you can go and check out. Frankl realized that a psychiatrist in a concentration camp has a responsibility to study suffering and reduce suffering. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us, he realized. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life, daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which life constantly sets for each individual. The sense of calling comes from the question, what's my responsibility here? What am I called towards? What's my responsibility here? Frankl went on to work as a psychotherapist in the camp, reminding despairing prisoners that the world still expected things of them. They still had responsibilities and purposes to pursue. So the real question for the vocation is not, what do I want to do? What can I make the most money at? Or what will make me happy? The real question is, what is life asking of me? More important than finding the answers is making sure that you're asking the right questions, something we've learned quite a lot about on the channel. What can you expect if you're asking, how much money can I make this year? Or how can I gain more status in the workplace? Or how can I make myself happy at work? These are shallow questions that quite honestly deserve the shallow answers that they return. Let's take a look at your vocation by taking a page from Mastery by Robert Greene, another book I really recommend that you check out, kind of all around purpose and vocation. He says, that might be fine if you're willing to settle for something meager like a career. Settle for something meager like a career. Very funny. But if you're trying to discern your vocation, the right question is not, what am I good at? It's the harder questions. It's what am I motivated to do? What activity do I love so much that I'm going to keep getting better at it for the next many, many decades? What do I desire so much that it captures me at a depth of my being? In choosing a vocation, it's precisely wrong to say what you're talented in should trump your interests. Interest multiplies talent, and in most cases is more important than talent. The crucial terrain to be explored in any vocation is the terrain of your heart and soul, your long-term motivation. Knowledge is plentiful, motivation is scarce. So instead of asking things about money or, how you can have a cushy job with a nice office, think about what are you really called to do. And if you don't spend your time thinking about what am I really called to do, what am I extraordinarily passionate about, you're going to end up being past. So 10 years into your career, you might have a nice job. You might have the status. But if you don't truly love your career, what ends up happening is, of course, you get passed by someone who really does. And eventually, you're no longer at the top of your field because you just don't have the energy, kind of the passion to really learn and spend the long hours that it might take to become good or to become great. So here are the questions that you should actually ask yourself, according to Robert Greene. He says, what am I motivated to do? And this is something that kind of Frankel and David Brooks are both talking about here as well, is like, what's this inner calling that I feel? What's this thing that I can't get out of my head for whatever reason it might be? Number 2 is, what activity do you love so much that you will keep getting better at it for the next many, many decades? And that's another piece as well. If you're not willing to commit to something for 10, 20, 30 years, it's very unlikely that you'll ever be the best at that particular thing. What do I desire so much that it captures me at a depth of my being? And again, this is just talking about the deep calling that you should feel to know that you're on the right path, to know that you're living with meaning, to know that you're going to be willing to make the commitments that are important to make, to know that you're going to be able to get to the level where joy is a part of your everyday life. Now you might be thinking, these sound an awful lot like follow your purpose or things like, maybe The Secret and that sort of thing, positive thinking. But it's not necessarily follow your purpose in some mystical type of a way, right? It's something that you need to feel deeply called towards the vocation, because if you're not going to be propelled to work hard and really become great. Choosing this path is actually not the easy path, even though it sounds maybe a little easier to say follow your purpose. You'll want to do stuff to stuff down your impulses with that cushy office job and the nice house. But the sacrifice that you're making there will eventually show itself in low-grade depression. Something that I've felt before, and something that Robert Greene talks about quite a lot in his book, Mastery. Again, if you want to learn a little bit more about vocation and what it means to follow kind of your purpose, find your life's purpose inside of a vocation, I recommend that you go and check out Mastery by Robert Greene. Our next point is about relationships. During these low moments, it is helpful to remember that marriage is not just a relationship, it's a covenant. It's a moral promise to hold fast through thick and thin. Both people have vowed to create this project or cause, the marriage, that is more important than each other's personal, emotional weather. Of course, there are times when divorce is the right and only course, but there are other times when the sentiment that guides Parker Palmer comes in handy. If you can't get out of it, get into it. If you can't easily walk away from something, then the only way forward is to double down. And in my experience, any relationship has its highs and lows. David points out here that often what we need to do in those low points is actually spend our time recommitting. Instead of kind of listing off all the things that the other person has done wrong, you need to take some time to step back and recommit. That takes dedication, work, and commitment. You need to re-fall in love with your partner during these difficult times. This might even be going against what makes you happy for the time being before that you can push through and finally be in love and enjoy. And I don't kind of claim to be some sort of a relationship expert, but I have found this to be true in my own life. Inside the book, David talks about how a marriage isn't just there to make us happy. And I think what you'll notice is that joy and commitment kind of run themselves through everything, through vocation, through our relationships, through so many different areas of our life. It's important that the relationship is actually there to make you grow. Learning how to be interdependent within your relationship so that together you're stronger is a lifelong journey, one that's sure to have a few bumps along the way. Commitment helps you see through those bumps. And I would take a step back and say, this doesn't even necessarily need to be a romantic relationship. This could be friendships, this could be business relationships. It's good to have a deep level of commitment to each one of those relationships to know that, if a person makes a small mistake, you're not going to kind of irrationally let go of the relationship, and they're not going to do the same thing. That level of commitment from both sides is very steadying, and it's a really great place for a relationship to kind of grow and to flower. So commitment from both sides in any relationship, and to know that you're both on the same path and you guys are both in a deep level of commitment together, that is just one of the best feelings on earth. It's very, very safe. Our next idea here is about faith, and this might be a controversial one to some of you. But God doesn't seem to want the elimination of the will. He seems to want the training and the transformation of it. He doesn't want the lack of will, but a merger between the will of the person and the will of God. A believer approaches God with a humble reverence and comes through study and prayer of spiritual disciplines to get a feel for the grain of God's love. She gradually learns to live along the grain of God's love and not against the grain. It is not a willful attempt to dominate life, nor is it a complete surrender of self-annihilation. It's an enthusiastic response. It is a participation, the complex participation of a person's will into God's larger will. Faith and grace are not about losing agency. They're about strengthening and empowering agency while transforming it. When grace floods in, it gives us better things to desire and more power to desire them. When people talk about dying to self, they are really talking about dying to old desires and coming alive to a new and better set of desires. So we're talking about climbing the mountain. We're talking about commitment. We're talking about joy, vocation, relationships, and community. Where does faith fall into all of this? David, of course, talks a lot about faith in the book. And for me, that's just not my personal style in these mind maps. But I would say that philosophy, spirituality have been a really great antidote to my own overgrown ego. Spending time in quiet meditation, thinking about my purpose here and on my life has helped me to commit to things that we're talking about here today, like spending my time helping others instead of trying to grow a big business like I was doing before. Sacrificing my short-term happiness, for example, for long-term prosperity of others, and really giving back to the world instead of focusing on how much the world could give to me. I can say that it's been one of the most transforming things that I've ever done. Whether your faith is in a particular belief or a particular religion or not, getting in touch with your spiritual side, in my view, is a very worthy investment. So, how are you going to get in touch with your spiritual and faithful side? Well, there's, of course, a lot of different ways, and if you've got yours already and it's a particular religion or whatever it is, that's really great. I really applaud you for taking kind of that step and making sure that you're really kind of covering every side of what it means to be a human being. But if not, and you're looking for something, here are a few books that I've read and I've loved over the past year or so. I think that all the Stoic books inside my playlist are a really great starting point for the non-spiritual among us. They kind of give us guides and rules, and they've got this weird interaction where they're people so long ago that they can almost feel spiritual to us. I really enjoy those books for that reason. It's really great kind of religious rules for the non-religious. Anything by Michael Singer. Now, I really loved his book, The Surrender Experiment, for example, in particular, and I think it's great for those that are maybe spiritual, but they're fighting back against organized religion. They don't want to go into a specific church or anything like that. I think Michael Singer does a really good job of explaining the spiritual without kind of diving too much into a religion, which is helpful, I think, for some of us. Our final idea here is all about community. The core flaw of hyper-individualism is that it leads to a degradation and pulverization of the human purpose. It's a system built on the egoist drives within each of us. These are self-interested drives, the drive to excel, to make the mark on the world, to rise in wealth and power and status, to win victories and be better than others. Hyper-individualism does not emphasize and eventually does not even see the other drives. The deeper and more elusive motivations that seek connection and fusion and service and care. These are not the desires of the ego, but the longings of the heart and the soul. The desire to live in a loving interdependence with others. The yearning to live in service with some ideal. The yearning to surrender to a greater good. Hyper-individualism numbs these deepest longings, and eventually, hyper-individualism creates isolated, self-interested nomads who sense that something is missing in their lives, but cannot even name what it is. Previously, we spoke about happiness versus joy. And one of the main motivators for the ego is happiness and short-term pleasure. Again, that's where you're intently focused mostly on yourself, making choices that help you find those two things. But the ego is a very short-term thinker. It wants happiness and pleasure now and forgoes what might be truly important. And as David says here, it doesn't even emphasize or even see some of these more elusive motivations, the motivation for connection and fusion and service and care. And instead, of course, it's just focused mostly on wealth, power, and status. So at the end of this mind map and at the end of this video, I want you to think, what's truly important? Is it wealth? Is it status? Is it power? Or is it the longings of the heart and the soul? The desire to love others, the desire to be of service, and the desire to sacrifice for the greater good. This has been The Second Mountain by David Brooks. I want to thank you for being with me here today. If you're interested, I recommend that you go and check out some of the other books that I've recommended on the channel. And if you're interested in masterclasses, dozens and dozens of books and hundreds of hours of learning and of reading and of synthesizing information, all compacted down into a 2-hour-long masterclass, then I recommend you go over to themindmapguy.com and check out what I have to offer. Thanks again for being with me here today, and I'll see you in the next video.